Okay, so now we're going to talk about the tree retention reporting and how it fits into the matrix here. And of course, I've got my little photo insert from the matrix. We've got Orpheus and the whole other crew. Everyone's got sunglasses on. Too cool. But again, so there's an example of the matrix in front of you. It's basically a Word document and with several sort of links and activities that'll be going on through it. And again, it sort of links survey manual guidance to the tree retention guidance. So let's work through it. Into the matrix we go. So again, the tree retention reporting, it really deals with retention openings with the greater than 5 square meters. I just got to keep on beating that drum, unfortunately, but just to be very, very clear, if you've got less, 5 square meters or less, then turn off your computer now because you don't need all this other complexity that I'm attempting to make simple. So there's a link between the two documents, the surveys manual and the tree retention manual. What I've done is broken it down into basically 4 kind of columns, and then you move throughout the matrix from left to right. We start at number 1 and make our way over to number 4. So we look, first step is conifer management regime. And again, let's highlight that this is for conifers. We're not dealing with mixed wood or deciduous management specifically in reporting here. So we're just dealing with conifers. So we'll keep it simple right now. So there's another removal of complexity. So what is the regime? What's the objective? What do you want to do with these stands? What is the whole intent of the management in these stands? Once you define that, once we get some clarity around that, we can move forward. If we don't have that clarity, we've got a little bit of a gap moving forward and ultimately reporting it. So I really highlight that we get that nailed down. But as life does progress and the way it ends up, things end up in your lap and you end up with planned or unplanned or resultant stand structure. And so I try to categorize that within the matrix too. If we've got this type of stand structure, here's some illustrations of that structure. Here's some actual links to some photographs of examples of the structure built into this matrix as well. Again, we make a bit of a link as in the survey manual. How would you survey? What would be the recommended methodology to survey that type of stand structure that you've inherited or planned for? And how would you measure that? Obviously, it has to be tailored to a standard, regeneration standard. Then once you get that done and you actually have some information and you're looking at making a declaration or meeting your obligation, how do I get it into results, or how do I, your reporting requirements at regen or at free growing? How do I get into results? And there's 2 columns there, would be long-term retention or short-term retention. So those are some of the splits that we have. And so we'll move down. We'll just kind of look at the conifer regime kind of aspects first and see how I have that broken down. As you can see, so that's the first column. We call it column 1. And there's 3 options there. We have 1A, 1B, 1C. So 1A is the timber is your main priority here. That is the main obligation, is to grow trees, and in this case conifers. And we have several options within this objective. We either have single entry even aged option, so you're going in and you're removing some volume. One-shot deal. You're not going in multiple times. It's one go. You do have a timber obligation, meaning that you haven't left enough standing trees to meet your obligation, which would actually be 1C. And it's usually a longer rotation. Or the other one would be some multiple entry, uneven age management, single tree or group selection, which can be fitting into that complex vertical, meaning all the tree layers from 1 to 4, or a combination of that exist on the block. And also you could have that horizontal group selection type option where you're taking out groups of trees over time. Again, multiple entries, taking groups of trees and multiple entries. So it's some classification of that structure in that context. Next one would be 1B, obligation non-timber. Basically touches on everything above. Again, different objective, might look identical, absolutely identical. In some cases, not totally identical, and I'll explain that a little bit further. But again, there's different reasons why you're leaving that structure there behind. Visual, you've got to leave some stems. It's a one-shot deal, but I've got to leave so many stems per hectare, so such basal area has to be retained in order to screen that block from some established viewpoint, for an example. So the last one is no obligation. This is really the intermediate cut, commercial thin type of situation, where what you leave behind is sufficient enough to meet regen goals. So what I'm saying here, again, these are guidelines, which some districts have them encrypted as standards, some do not. So in the interior, it's greater than or equal to 20 square meters of basal area left over of acceptable species and acceptable condition. And the same on the coast would be a higher one, around 40 square meters. Now, typically, we're dealing with just a complex horizontal structure here, and it's dispersed retention normally. Now, commercial thin will be very uniform, dispersed retention. Intermediate cut can be more grouped and clumped and stuff like that, but ultimately it ends up with around above these thresholds that are suggested above. So here's an attempt to categorize this conifer management regime. Okay, so now we're going to dive into the matrix, and I will just shrink out this heading and I will pull the matrix up. Here we go. So this is basically the guidance matrix that will end up being published as an appendix in the Tree Retention Guidebook, and it will be an appendix in the surveys guidebook as well. So it'll be populated in both camps. And so the whole idea here is to, as we have noticed here, I can, what I've done is have that split on the top. I'm just going to sort of highlight, maybe I can highlight some rows here. Yeah, there we go. You can highlight that row. And so what I've done is separated 1 to 3 is for the survey manual as columns, and 4A to 4B is the tree retention. And these are live links, so you can, I'll just go, let me go to the manual. Yeah, there we go. And you let me go there. See if I can pull up the surveys manual just to give you an example. So you can go to the surveys manual, or you can go to the tree retention guidebook, and I think it's down there. There it is. I get asked all kinds of questions here. Oh, goodness gracious. No, we don't want that. There we are. So there's the surveys manual from 2014, and that hot link will still exist and go to the 2015 one. So just to give you an example that way. And the same would happen for the tree retention guidebook as well. That's a hot link. And I'll just pull it up. But anyway, you get the idea that we go straight to that manual. Hopefully it's right over there. There it is. And there's the actual tree retention guidebook. So within these two documents, encrypted within the matrix are these red bullets. And this tells you the section within the document above, within the columns, where you can find these references within the matrix. So you can see over here, we talk about a layered survey. Under the survey methodology column, it's section 922. And subsequent sections all the way down, and we'll deal with those in detail. So the same with on this side, where we deal with the tree retention guidebook, which is the ultimate guidance and submission to the results. So if you open up that document and keep it down on your toolbar down below, you can go to section 4.1 where the explanation is about where it contains all of the long-term retention guidance pieces and examples, and here in section 4.2 is where all the short-term retention sections are. And of course, for each sort of example going across, we have all of these references as well. So as you can see from the way the document is set up, we explain the first step is the conifer management regime, and you look at A1, for example, timber priority. I'm just going to work through this example just to illustrate how the matrix would work. If I'm decided that I'm in a timber priority block and I'm a single entry even aged regime, then the next step is the resultant planned or resultant stand structure, and again is identified within the manual. There's some illustrations there in section 1.2 right at the beginning of the manual. It talks about that this is typically usually more appropriate for basal areas less than 10 square meters on the coast and less than 18 on the 10 on the interior and 18 on the coast. If we go further down in the document, when you're looking at non-timber priorities for these types of complex stands, again, single entry, it's usually with the basal areas are a little bit higher. We've got a little bit more complexity because we have to, because it's a non-timber priority. Really what I'm saying here, if you're actually managing for timber and you've got some retention in the overstory, say for silviculture reasons, you want to have a shaded environment in order to grow a certain species, or you're banking on seed tree coming in and you want to retain those stems for that reason or whatever. Normally these thresholds have been suggested as thresholds to allow for some form of productive growth of regen underneath. And these other non-timber obligations, you don't have a choice. You've got to leave these higher levels of retention. For some reason, getting up close to the threshold for intermediate cuts, and it's going to compromise your growth in your understory because timber's being trumped by some other non-timber objective, visuals, wildlife, something like that. We're taking a bit of a hit there. So this is where I'm trying to suggest, and again, these are suggested numbers, but are best practice kind of thresholds. It's going to change in every jurisdiction, every site series, every BEC subzone. Just trying to give you a bit of a context here. So there may be within this column, this plan structure, a few more definitions as to what would be appropriate, what would not, and give you some boundaries. So the next one is again to assist in sort of capsulating this stand structure. It's all sort of grouped in this step number 2, and there's usually a bit of a visual image here. You can blow it up. They're fairly small. Get a bit of an idea of the structure we're dealing with. In this situation, we don't have all of the layers occupied. We've got groupings of sort of layer 2s or 3s. We've got layer 4 down here, and we've got these individuals of layer 1s around, just showing that sort of lower basal area. If we're really interested in growing trees, it's pretty tough in British Columbia to have a complete canopy over top and grow trees underneath. We just don't have those tolerant hardwoods that support that type of really dense multi-layered structure. And we're not in the tropics either, so we don't quite get that kind of growth. So this is just some illustration, visual image of this type of situation. And then if you, I should shrink this down a little bit more. It's getting a little big. There we go. So this is a live link to some photos that are at the back end of the matrix here to give you another kind of lift on that. And so it goes to images, photo images number 1. And you can see that the obligation, I've sort of separated down some of the different descriptive factors here. It's obligations timber, single entry, even age, complex vertical structure, and dispersed retention at the same time. So here's would be an aerial view, and here's a plan, photographic view of what an example of what that might look like. And these are attempted to be photographs from around the province. And here's a bit of a photo montage of different types of stands as well. Again, that I would think would fit into this category. Timber is the main objective. We've had some retention for whatever reason. It could possibly be even non-merchantability. These stems are not merchantable, but maybe there's some reason why these stems are retained. Maybe it's just for silviculture reasons. So that gives you an idea. And basically, you'll have to scroll up to go back to the matrix. So the third column is number 3, and this is where the survey methodology. And here I've recommended a layered survey approach, and section 922 of the survey manual. If you want to know what that means, when I say layered approach, you're going to have to stick around for the recording for module number 2. And then we get into the treed retention guidebook. And we have, if it's a long-term retention or short-term retention, there's a couple of different ways of reporting it within results. And within the treed retention guidebook. And I'm not going to walk through every page in the treed retention guidebook. I would lose everybody on the phone and they'd all fall asleep. So that's not the intent. What I'm going to do now is just work through some examples. I'm going to pick a couple of rows out of the matrix here, out of obligation timber priority, out of obligation non-timber priority, and out of no obligation in the intermediate cut and commercial thin, and work through the matrix in that regard. Okay, so hang in there. We'll go back to the slideshow, and I'm going to go work through five examples, basically 5 case studies. So here's the case study scenario part. Our first one's going to be take you around the province. We're going to go into Merritt and IDF, interior fir, vets, 5 to 20 square meters left in the overstory, and there's layer 1 and layer 4 in the block. Our second case study is going to be Tofino, CWH, VH1. Ooh, it's wet out there, guys. You want to work there early in your career. You get too old, you get too much arthritis. We're going to look at Cedrus, single entry dispersed retention stocking standard, and how that might work in that neck of the woods. Number 3 will be Williams Lake woodlot, again IDF multi-story single tree selection. Number 4 will be Powell River, a woodlot CWH intermediate cut type of situation. And number 5 will be Quesnel. We'll go back to the interior and ESSF caribou habitat group selection type of stand structure. So we got a bit of a mix here of scenarios. An attempt to touch a few of the bases, but obviously I won't satisfy everybody. But we'll give it a try. Here we go. Okay, so our first scenario would be in Merritt, and we'll start there. So here's a bit of the site description. This IDF DK1 dispersed retention. Timber management is the objective here. We're going to grow trees, we're going to grow conifers. What we've got is left over from after the logging is layer 1 vets. We're left, for whatever reason, 5 to 20 square meters on average, above 9 square meters of basal area left in the block. Layer 4 is made up of pine and fir, 70-30, and even age stocking standards. So this is basically where we're going to land on the matrix is 1AI. And what does that look like? Let's go back here. We're back to the matrix. Hang on to your seat. I don't want to lose you. 1A, obligation I, single entry. So we can just attempt to highlight that whole row. And that's basically what I had described, is this type of stand, this vertical structure, interior. Our average is basal area is about under 10 square meters, so it kind of fits. Looks like some of these, this stand structure, and a layered survey would be the way to go. And here's a couple of options on how to report it. So we'll go back to PowerPoint presentation and look at how that might be reported. So as I mentioned, layered survey methodology, treed reporting. This is how you would report it in the surveys manual. We call it short term. So it's unharvested stems are left. So it's section 424. How we would report this would be reserve type dispersed. The timber objective would be TIM. And what we would report in the inventory and silviculture component would be layer 1 and 4. If layer 1 crop trees are in the silviculture label, then they would be reported if you accept them. If they're not, they wouldn't be in the silviculture label, but you do have to report layer 1 here, as I said earlier, because you've got greater than 5 square meters over here. And our tree cover pattern is 5. Again, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about the tree cover pattern. That's all we have to do, and then the rest of the basic reporting would end up. So it's that simple, really. It's a little more complex when you read it in the treed retention guidebook, but those are the attributes that you have to fill in. And I've just pulled those right out of section 424, the treed retention. So those are the attributes we would require or recommend that you put into results to be consistent. So that's what it looks like on the ground. I made this up a bit of a blend. I mean, they're not super accurate. This may not be the actual block from the air, but this is actual block that I got those criteria from. This was actually another block, but it just gives you a context of what I'm talking about. Okay. Again, a couple of other examples here. We've already seen this photo. Here's a couple of other examples as well. Here's a little grouping in the middle. We've got some retained trees on the outside. And here's a larch example with these leftover larches throughout the whole block. Again, single entry in the sense that we're only taking one harvest and we're going away. There's a possibility you could come back and take these out. That's why we call it short-term retention, dispersed retention, short-term. But really, operationally, is that feasible or not? Can you run a skidder up here and just take those out without damaging the regen around? I mean, that's always a challenge. Okay, so our second example would be Williams Lake woodlot. So here we are in Williams Lake in a woodlot. We're in the IDF DK3, single entry, single tree selection, dispersed retention, timber management, all layers. We've got fir and pine in all layers, 8 square meters per hectare on the overstory, uneven age stocking standards. So let's quickly go back to the matrix, and we're in this line here. I think it was 1A2, and so the main criteria here is if you're going to be using this system, it's IDF is really recommended as the only application of this. IDF subzone. That's the best application for this type of system of single tree multiple entry. And so there's the visual image and multi-story stocking or survey methodology 921, and we really only have one reporting option here, so it's 421. It's in the short-term section because you're coming back and potentially taking those trees out again. So let's go back to the PowerPoint and finish up that slide. So this is what you would report. So it's short-term, single tree, section 421, dispersed, timber is the objective. Inventory component and silviculture component will have potentially all 4 layers. You could have a couple of these middle layers missing depending on the structure of your stand, but it's a complex layer reporting, and so each layer is reported, and cover pattern 8. So fairly dense overstory left over. Okay? And that's what it might look like from the from the air and looking on a plan view from the ground, you've got quite a bit of structure here, quite a bit of retention. That's why we kind of went with that 8 pattern. Okay, our third scenario case study would be in Tofino, CWH, VH1 dispersed retention, non-timber priority, cultural cedar retention, layer 1 and 2 hemlock and cedar left over, 70-30 cedar, 20 square meters of retention, layer 3 hemlock, cedar, pine. It's been regenerated, that's why it's up into layer 3. It's already past breast height, so it's bumped up into layer 3. Even age management. So we don't have an uneven age management, non-timber objective. We've left a lot of retention. Where's that? So I'll just show you on the matrix where that is. We're down in obligation, but non-timber, single entry, even aged. We're really on this column here. It's below that threshold of 40 square meters, but you've got a lot of retention. You've got about 20 square meters, and so it's higher than this 18 threshold that we're suggesting up above. So because we need to leave more for a non-timber value, it's forcing us in that category. And this is really where the single entry dispersed retention, which is a derivative of deviation from potential survey standard. It's explained in the manual, in surveys manual in 924. And you've got a couple of options here, either long-term or short-term reporting aspects. So let's just look at how that would shake down for our scenario. In this case, we're saying it's a long-term dispersed retention because we're not going to be able to access those standing trees for the cultural heritage retention. I think that it may be some higher level plan saying that you have to retain so many within a certain landscape unit, and this one would contribute to that. So kind of making it up a little bit, but then paraphrasing within that work zone to make it work for my example here for this scenario. So reserve type is dispersed, reserve objective is cultural heritage, it's a long-term. Inventory and silviculture components are reported for all layers. Only the layer 1 will be in the silviculture label if they contribute to stocking. They can, and depending if they meet all of the damage criteria. And the cover pattern is 5, so it's sort of the middle of the road as far as the amount of retention within the block. So what might that look like? It's one of the examples I've already shown, and that's what it actually looks like from the air. So it's very corridor oriented, but some of these strips have been thinned out more than others, more so down in here where these ones are a little more prominent. But this is what it looks like in the plan view. That's the resultant view. If you're in the interior using a DFP, this might be where you would use it in this type of block. You can see some of these retention strips are actually in strips. I think this looks like larch. And again, here's one with fir. But again, higher basal area left behind, higher impact on your growing site due to the crown influence, and getting a little more complex to survey and report. But again, maybe a good example that way. Okay, so let's go to Quesnel, and I'm going to deal with this scenario. So this would be 1B3. 1B3, let's see where that is on the matrix. And 1B3, there we are. So this one is a group selection, complex horizontal structure, group retention. It kind of look like this image here, where you've got these patches that are open. They're wide enough that you're getting pretty good growth in the middle. You can use a variety of approach here. Either it's a clear-cut method if it's greater than 10 meters wide, or small-scale openings survey methodology if it's a little bit narrower. And pretty well only have one option to report, and that's under the group selection section within the retention manual 422. There'll be no test on the sections to remember them. Don't worry. There's no quiz at the end. You don't have to pass that. I wouldn't even know that. I don't even have that memorized. So anyway, so here's the description of the site. It's ESSF WK1. It's a multiple entry group selection regime, non-timber priority, caribou habitat protection. They can only take out a certain percentage of these openings, but they'll be taken out in a shorter cutting cycle, so that you end up with a multi-age stand collectively over. So it's a group selection type of approach. Layer 1 is existing in the retained groups, balsam and Engelmann spruce, about 22 square meters, and it's layer 4 is being regenerated with Engelmann spruce and Lasiocarpa as well in the openings. So it's uneven age management, but in the group scenario. So a little more complicated, but again, this is because of caribou, and that's what they want to do. So it's short term because these groups will be removed at some point on a cutting cycle before the larger cutting rotation age for would be even aged if it was an even age block. And so the reserve type is group. The reserve objective is timber. We're going to take it out for timber, and that allows it to go on the short-term regime. I know there's a little bit of a conflict here. It isn't a non-timber priority block, but you're using this timber objective. So there's a little bit of a clunky bit in the reporting. Sorry about that, but it's the way it actually has to go, because you're taking it on a shorter rotation. So this group selection is a bit of a exemption that way. Inventory would be layer 1's only for the reserve groups, and you have to report those separately. It'd be separate polygon. And the inventory and silviculture layers 4 for the cuts, you would have a label for both of those. So for the tree pattern, you really only have to report that for the SU that pertains to the group selection, just the parts that are retained. So what might that look like? So this is the actual caribou study east of Quesnel. That's what it looks like from the air. And believe it or not, I think this photograph was taken, I think in that opening. Possibly. I can't recall. I believe so. But anyway, you can see they're fairly large openings, big, basically a clear-cut situation within the opening, and here's the retained sections in behind. And the cutting cycle is short enough so that it's a shorter term, and it ends up being, these have really a timber objective in that context. So a little bit of a anomaly. So group selection, like small scale clear cut, if it's greater than 10 meters wide, otherwise it's a single tree selection, or intermediate cut if it's less than that. So, you know, these openings are greater than 10 meters wide. So again, I'm just trying to illustrate that if they're greater than 10 meters wide, then you can use the clear-cut survey type of methodology. You're not getting that edge effect that we define within the matrix as well. You can see here that we're getting a little bit tight between openings, where this way we're probably far enough apart. Again, you can see in this opening I think we're wide enough open this way, but silviculturally you got to consider that this might be facing north-south. And if you've got an opening that's greater than 10 meters, but you've got maybe up to 70 meters, I think Dave Coates' work has shown that that's enough light for even to grow pine in. So we're not getting any modified microclimate approaching kind of like a single tree selection if we get under that 10-meter threshold. So that's what I just want to kind of illustrate there. Okay, so our last example will be from Powell River, a woodlot as well. And so the site description would be, let's just look at the matrix here. I'll just close that out and go back over to this one. So we're in the non-obligation. We were in 1C1, I believe. So there'd be this row. So we have complex horizontal structure, dispersed retention. So this is an intermediate cut that we're kind of highlighting here, and then little patches have been taken out, and it basically fits into the commercial thin type of assessment if you're going to assess it that way, to see that you have enough post entry stocking, because you don't really have any regen objectives, and that's how you report it. It's a short term. You may go in next month, next week, or next year, or in 5 years, 10 years, but you're going to come back and possibly take out the rest of that opening, whatever is retained in there. So it's no regen objectives, but shorter term. But I jump ahead. Let's just describe the stand. So it's Coastal Western Hemlock XM1 intermediate cut, timber management, pole removal. Nice market for cedar poles, so let's take a few out of there. Still have to call it an opening. Layer 1 is retained, that's it. Cedar 70 for 30, 45 square meters on average left behind, so it's greater than 40 square meters, so no stocking obligation, but must create an opening in results. Really, that's the take-home message here as well. So, commercial thin survey is described within the survey's manual. Short-term retention, no regen obligations is section 423 within that reporting manual. Reserve type is dispersed. Timber objective is timber. Inventory and silviculture components are reported, but it's only the layer 1. And our tree pattern is 9, so really dense cover left over. That image for 9 would be pretty solid, almost a solid gray. So that's what the stand might look like. This is actually an aerial shot of a helicopter log, intermediate cut. You know, a few openings here, kind of scattered. That's what you get with the intermediate cut. You don't get that really uniform distribution of stems, but collectively within the opening, there's enough left over for another pass. This is actually a woodlot in Powell River where the poling was going on, and they did a wonderful job and didn't do any damage. Any damage. There was retained stems, took some volume out, but it's within an opening that's been identified and will come back. This is interior BC, where I think the pine was removed. It was deemed that there was enough basal area left behind that it supported a intermediate cut. Here's a commercial thin, obviously a much more uniform horizontal structure, evenly spaced, hoping to have some release of those trees that are left behind so that you can harvest them, or get some response, sorry, and then the next harvest is fairly close to the end of rotation. Again, another example of commercial thin. So there we are. We're done this module. That's the end of the module. We'll just summarize here. So this is the retention measurement and reporting module, and just a summary. So we talked about complex vertical and horizontal structure, trying to quantify that in certain aspects. What I've been talking about all today is primarily planned and unplanned tree retention, greater than 5 square meters basal area left on the landscape. So it's when that is left over in the overstory, this is where this guidance applies. We're using existing results design, best fit. Again, a little clunky, got to admit, but we're looking at reserve type, objective, and reporting of the layers into results in the categories that have been identified. Again, we're looking at the 5 square meters has to be reported into results. That's a have to do in the inventory label, just the inventory label so far. What does it look like? We went through examples of that. We hopefully have some visual images, some boundaries. I know it's really tough to stand there and guess. Some folks have a lot of experience with looking at basal area within their operating area, can get it fine, and I think that's what we have to strive for as the art side of our business. Tree retention guidebook, we went over reserve type, group or dispersed, short or long term, timber or non-timber objectives, and the different patterns that need to be reported, cover patterns, And then we work through the matrix, that link between the Silviculture Surveys Manual and the tree retention reporting, and how that functions, and how you can kind of look at examples and diagrams and the definitions of all of the columns within that. Okay, well, thank you very much for listening to me, and hopefully you found this informative and helpful in reporting your retention within the province. If you're interested in getting into more detail about surveys, go for the Module 2 on the methodologies of retention surveying. Or if you have any questions or reasons to get a hold of me, you can always get me in Victoria, Dave Weaver, and I'm in the book or in the government website, and you can get a hold of me that way. Thank you very much, and thanks for listening. Bye for now.